Okay, so we'll go back a little bit. This lesson is 3.4, part 1, and we're learning about how to find the slope using the slope formula. So we talked about how slope is the ratio of the vertical change to the horizontal change. Which is your run, between any 2 points on the line, represented by the letter M. So this is where the slope formula comes about, your y2 minus y1 over x2 minus x1. I know you've all heard it before. So here's a diagram of a line, and you've got 2 points. This is your first point, and this is your second point. So we'll label this first point as x1, comma y1, and then we'll label the second point as x2, comma y2. And you know the ones and twos are just notation differentiating the first point from the second point. So in order to calculate how much you're rising, so it's rise over run, you have to find this distance. How do you find the distance between 2 points? Here's an example. Let's say we measure Aaron, how high he is at the beginning of the year, and then we measure him again at the end of the year. He's probably going to get taller, right? So how do we find, you're not going to get shorter, you're going to get taller. How do we find the difference between how high he was at the beginning of the year versus the end of the year? Okay, you subtract them. So what we'll have to do here, this is like that, so we'll subtract the taller one minus the shorter one. So that would be x2, sorry, not x, y, because the height is the y2 minus y1. And then to get your, sorry, no, you can't see that very well. Let me fix this. Then to get your run, so that would be your rise, y2 minus y1. And then to get your run, you would do the same thing, but you would subtract your horizontal components of the points, so x2 minus x1, to find the difference that it moved in the x direction. So over x2 minus x1. And that is how you find the slope between any 2 points. You can still use rise over run if you have a graph, but for example, if your points are decimals, then you might want to use the slope formula. Or if you don't want to graph it, then and you only have the coordinates, then you would use slope formula. If it's a word problem, you would use the slope formula. So there's so many applications of slope formula because change and rate is everywhere in the real world. So we'll talk more about applications tomorrow. Today's just the basics of using the formula. So let's practice. Our first point is 5, 2, and 4, negative 1. So we're going to find the slope between these 2 points. So I always like to set it up as m equals, and then draw a fraction bar. So we'll do our y2 minus y1. If it helps, you can label them. So the first one we'll call x1, y1, and the second point we'll call x2, y2. So negative 1 is our y2, 2 is our y1. So we'll do negative 1 minus 2, negative 1 minus 2 over x2 minus x1. So 4 minus 5. And then you would simplify it. So negative 1 minus 2 is negative 3. And then 4 minus 5 is negative 1. If you have two negatives, you should always cancel them out. So that would just be positive 3. So the slope between those 2 points is 3. Okay, let's try part B. So m equals fraction bar. So we'll do y2 minus y1, 1 minus 5, over x2 minus x1, 6 minus 3. Some of you, it'll help to draw the arrows to make sure that you're subtracting the right numbers. You don't want to subtract the coordinates, like you don't want to do 1 minus 6. You don't want to do 1 minus 3. You want to do 1 minus 5. Okay, so then that would be negative 4 over 3. Since negative 4/3 doesn't simplify, you could just leave it like that. So improper fractions are totally fine when we're talking about slope, because when you have m, and if you're trying to graph it, you do want to know your rise over run. So if you try to put it in a mixed number, then you won't know your rise over run. Okay, so C has some fractions in it. No worries, we can handle fractions. Now, so far, I've done this y minus the second y minus the first y. So it actually doesn't matter which order you subtract them in as long as you're consistent. So if I do 5 minus negative 3, then I also have to do 9/2 minus 1/2. So let's try doing it that way just to mix it up and see the difference between them. So the numerator would be 5 minus negative 3. Remember when we were doing those that Get More Math yesterday, and some of it had integers like this, and some people didn't like how the second number was in parentheses, but that just helps us to tell the difference between what we're subtracting and what we're adding. So here we're subtracting negative 3, and you know if you minus a negative, that becomes plus a positive. So two negatives make a plus. And then the denominator would be 9/2 minus 1/2. So actually subtracting it in this order makes it so that your numerator and your denominator are positive instead of negative. So it actually doesn't matter the order, like I said, as long as you're consistent and you subtract in the same direction. But if you want to avoid negatives, you can subtract this way instead of the other way that we subtracted the first two questions. All right, so this is going to be 8 over 9/2 minus 1/2. What's 9/2 minus 1/2? Cool. 8/2, which is 4. So I'm just going to write 4 here. And then 8 over 4 reduces to 2. Okay. For part D. So let's do m equals y2 minus y1, 4 minus 4 over x2 minus x1, 4 minus negative 2. So 4 minus 4 is 0, and then 4 minus negative 2 is 6. But what is 0 over 6? It's 0. So what happens if the slope is 0? Yeah, Ellen? It's horizontal. Okay, so let's write that down. Now in your homework, whenever you have a horizontal or vertical line, it's also going to ask you to write the equation. So do you remember how to write the equation of a horizontal line from earlier this week, Logan? Not 0. Look at your coordinates. What coordinate repeats itself? The 4. So it's y equals 4. So keep in mind also, some people try to use the 6, this number, to write the equation. That number doesn't have anything to do with the equation. It's the numbers that are in the coordinates. So whatever number is repeating, then you can tell that it's y equals or x equals that number. Okay, I'll give you a head start on part E and F. And if you get a horizontal or vertical line, then you can also write the equation. guys, for questions where you're dividing by 0, how does that work? So if you get negative 4 over 0, is the answer negative 4? Is the answer 0? Vaughn? Huh? Well, hang on a second. I'm asking what the answer is to negative 4 over 0. So this needs to be switched. Y over x. What's undefined? Yes, so for f, you should be getting negative 4 over 0. And since you can't divide by 0, your answer is undefined. And since the x's are repeating, that means it's an x equals equation, not a y equals equation. Where's your answer to E? Where's your answer to E? Okay, make sure you simplify it. Want to simplify your answers. Yeah, you can write UD or type or write out undefined and write the equation. Careful, this is 4 minus negative 2. If there are 2 negatives and it turns into plus. All right, here are the answers for E and F. So for E, you should get 1/2, because it's 6 minus 3 over 4 minus negative 2, and then minus negative becomes plus a positive, so that's 3 over 6, which is 1/2. And then F would be undefined, like we talked about, and the equation is x equals 3. Okay. What would be the slope for line G? Line G. Okay. Yes. So you have negative 2 minus 2 over 5 minus 5. So that's negative 4 over 0, so that's undefined. And then what's the equation? Cole.
X equals 4.
For G.
X equals 5.
Yes. Remember, it depends on the coordinates, not the number that you get in the slope. Okay, and then for H and F, I'll go ahead and just come around and check your answers to those two as an exit ticket sort of, but I also have a couple other questions that I'm going to ask, and that we'll do on the back page. So I'll write down the question up here so that you can start on it if you get done early. So essentially what we're going to do is we're going to try to find the missing coordinate using the slope formula. So our first one is 8, 1. Your points are 8, 1, x 7, and then m, your slope is negative 1/2. So if you want, you can start it early if you're just waiting for me. Just check everybody else's. Okay, you still have to say what the slope is.
I did
That's the equation. But what's the slope? So don't just leave it as 0 over negative 3.
It's not very good.
What is that? Is it 0, undefined, negative
Not very
3?
good, Gracie. Yeah, I can't see when I hop on the bike, so take with me.
You guys, you're doing this question on the back of your notes since there's a blank piece of paper. Blank page on the back of your notes.
Where's the question?
Like, flip to the back of your, yes, 0.
It's all locked in, I'll just put them right.
Yeah, so you guys, if you flip to the back of your notes, the very back, that's where you can do these problems, because we're gonna do a couple of them. Okay, but let me see here. Okay. I use this last year. And so that's what we're
Wait.
so you have to do
someone at my table made me get it wrong.
You can't divide by 0.
I wonder who that was.
So this question, you're working backwards. You need to reduce, and then you still need to say what the slope is. Oh. So we can't see what the slope is.
What'd you guys get?
Yeah, all of you guys can say what
I got
wrote the
20.
equation. The slope is not 0 or 3.
I got 10.
I got 20. So that's it. Look, I'll plug it back in and check it. So we're gonna put 20 right here. So you get 12 over 6, and that equals 1/2.
Yes, because the y.
7 minus 1.
Wait a minute, there should be a negative somewhere in there.
7 minus 8.
Excuse me?
Oh, that is 7 minus 8.
It is x equals 20 by 8.
Good.
No, it's not.
Yeah,
There needs to be a negative somewhere.
How?
Because it's
Oh, it's
negative.
negative
1/2.
1/2.
There needs to be a negative somewhere. So just negative, yeah, negative 1.
Okay,
It works
just to
in
touch base with this one, you guys, whenever you get 0 in a fraction, you have to simplify it. So never leave your fraction as 0 over 3. You always have to say 0. And if it's 3 over 0, you would say undefined. So it's like, that's not simplified. So it's like leaving a fraction unsimplified, except I would take a whole point off instead of just half a point. Okay, so let's figure out how to do these questions. So what we're going to do is set up our slope formula with what we have. So you're doing y2 minus y1. That would be 7 minus x. Sorry, 7 minus 1 over x2 minus x1, which is x minus 8. And just to clarify, this is a problem that is not in your notes, so you're doing it on the back of your paper. And there are 2 other problems that we're going to do, so make sure you save some room. Okay, and then equals what the slope actually is negative 1/2. Okay, what can you do to this equation so far? You see anything that we could do, Cole? Before we cross multiply. But yes, we are going to cross multiply. Kate?
Like it times 1/2 into negative 1/2 into negative 6 times.
Oh, you can do that if you want, but I'm talking about even before you do that. How about we simplify it? So 7 minus 1 is 6. Okay, so let's do that first. So you have 6 over x minus 8 equals negative 1/2. So Kate was talking about maybe making this an equivalent fraction and then comparing them. You could do that, but I think it might be easier sometimes with these to just cross multiply. So now the thing is, where do we put the negative sign? You're paying attention? Whenever there's a negative in front, what I usually do is assign it to whatever is in the numerator. So I'm going to make this a little clearer and put the negative sign with the 1. Because when we cross multiply, both the 1 and the 2 can't have the negative, or else that would be 2 negatives. Only one of the numbers can have the negative. So then we're going to cross multiply. So here we get 6 times 2, which is 12, equals, actually this might have been easier to give the negative sign to the 2, but that's all right. And then negative 1 times x minus 8. Okay, so if you didn't do it like this, maybe try it out anyways. Try cross multiplying. After this, you would have to distribute the negative 1. So you'd get 12 equals negative x and then plus 8, because negative 1 times negative 8 is positive 8. Then you would subtract the 8 over to get 4 equals negative x. So x equals negative 4, which I saw some of you got just by looking at the fraction, maybe. What'd you get? You got negative 20? So you must have made some mistake with your negatives, which is why, can you put here, just put those right here, because we don't need to touch them. Which is why sometimes it's just easier to cross multiply, that way you don't make a mistake. Okay, let's do one more. Let's do this one. So negative 3 comma 9, and then negative 1 comma y. And then your slope is 5. So if you set up slope formula, you would have y minus 9 over negative 1 minus negative 3. Since it's minus a negative, it's going to be plus 3 equals 5. But if you want to cross multiply, then you would put the 5 over 1. So first step is I'm going to simplify the denominator. So y minus 9 over 2 equals 5 over 1. And yes, I know some of you will just look at the fraction and figure it out, but otherwise you can still cross multiply. So 5 times 2 would be 10 equals y minus 9. Add the 9 over to get 19. And the reason I'm still teaching it this way with cross multiplying, even though you could compare the fractions by making this 10 halves, is that when we get to more complicated situations where this is a little more difficult or you have a bunch of negatives, then you might want to use cross multiplying just so you don't make a mistake. Okay. At this time, I am going to go over your tests with you. Mason, can you go into the hallway and you can take your Chromebook and start the homework. But for everybody else, I want you to go to your Unit 2 test in Edulastic. I will have to hand grade it, so your grade will likely not be what it's showing.